Hey everyone, it's time for the final part of Chapter 8, Module 8.4. And for this one, we're going to be learning about emotion, and what emotions are, how they work, and all the different theories about that. But before anything, we need to look and see what things we covered in our review guide. And so if you look at it, there's actually only 3 things that are going to be on the exam that come from this module. So let's get to it. And usually you would think that the very first thing that we talk about is going to be the definition. However, it's very hard to define emotions and to say what emotions are. And so when we ask that question, what are emotions? There's some things that we know. And one of those things is that it seems to be what we would call cross-species. And so this is kind of a silly example that shows a human and a gorilla. But a lot of times, and they're both expressing anger, you'll be able to pick up on the emotion in different animals, because the way that emotions are expressed and different facial expressions for emotions seems to go across various species. So when we look at emotions, instead of defining what emotions are, we instead know 3 components. And this is the first thing that you will need to know on the exam. The 3 main components that make up your emotion is bodily arousal. And so your body has some sort of kind of a physiological response to an emotion. There's the cognition. So you are thinking about, this situation, this thing, and that helps to bring about the emotion. And then the final part is the expressed behavior. And so obviously you are expressing that emotion in some way, shape, or form. So those are the 3 components to emotions. Also, when we look at emotions and its expression, we see that when it comes to basic emotions, they seem to be unlearned and universal. So you don't have to teach someone these emotions and they will start to automatically display them. They are reflected in the same facial expressions across cultures. So when someone is showing that they are happy, it does not matter what culture they come from, you still see it as happy. You also see it emerge in children according to their biological timetable of development. And what that means is what was actually expressed quite well in Inside Out, the movie, where at the very beginning the child could only experience happiness. And then there was happiness and sadness. And then as the child got older and older, more and more emotions started to develop. That's what we see in children, where there seems to just kind of be very, very basic emotions early on, and then a few more kind of what we consider basic emotions get added on as we develop. And though there's disagreements, depending on who your psychology teacher is, usually these are the ones that are considered the basic emotions. And as you will see, except for, I believe, surprise, all of those emotions, and I think, there was fear, I'm sorry. Those are all the emotions that were expressed in Inside Out. There was actually a lot of psychology in that movie when it comes to the idea of emotions. And so when we also talk about emotions, there's this whole idea of what we call display rules. And even though the emotions themselves are universal in all cultures, how you express them, and more importantly, when you express them, does differ by culture. And so there's different rules of, when you're allowed to show that you're happy, when you're allowed to show that you're upset. Do you have to wait until you get home, or are you allowed to express yourself right there? There's gender differences and gender rules to the expression of emotions, where there's this stereotype of, one gender is allowed to show emotions more than the other. And so there's all sorts of rules. And again, even the one that I just mentioned, that stereotype, is not true to every culture. So there's different display rules, but those emotions themselves are universal. Then there's this whole idea of happiness, this wonderful thing. And it is one of the things that I am incredibly interested in. I love positive psychology, which is the psychology of happiness. There is going to be an entire lecture on this that I will be doing at a later time. Well, I will be unlocking the secrets to happiness. So glad that you guys are in this class. You're going to be learning the secret to happiness as far as research is concerned. But happiness is a very important thing, and again, there will be a whole lecture that goes into this, but the thing to take away is that a lot of times what people think makes them happy, in the long run, does not actually lead to lifelong, sustainable happiness. But again, we'll talk about that in another lecture. This was a fun experiment that was done, and I'll be displaying it very shortly. In fact, I'll just have myself in the corner so you can still be reading this. But the facial feedback hypothesis, the experiment that they did for this is they had individuals, or this was one of the experiments that was done, they had individuals holding a pen in their mouth. And there was two different groups. One group held a pen in their mouth, or it might have been a pencil, same idea, like this. The other group had to hold the pen in their mouth like this. And then afterwards they would take a measure on, rating how they were feeling emotionally. And it was found that the group that had to hold the pen in their mouth like that, it seemed to experience more of a more pleasant emotion, a little bit higher in happiness than the other group. And this led to the facial feedback hypothesis, which is the whole idea of kind of, fake it till you make it. Just the action of smiling or expressing an emotion brings out that emotion. And I will go ahead and disappear myself again so I'm not distracting you guys. So the facial feedback hypothesis is the whole idea that, again, by mimicking a facial movement or a facial expression, it makes you feel that way. So if you really want to feel angry, make an angry face. If you want to feel happier, make a happy face. Now, obviously, this is not going to, cure depression. But it has been found in research that, making a fake smile does improve how you feel at least a little bit. Again, depending on the situation. Another thing that's really interesting is something that's known as Duchenne's smile. And so if you look on this PowerPoint, there are two very similar pictures of a guy smiling. One of them is a genuine smile. The other one is a fake smile. So which one, and I'll give you guys just a couple seconds to think, when you look at those, which one do you think, the one on the left or the one on the right, which one do you think is the genuine smile? I'll give you a couple more seconds. And I can now reveal that the genuine smile is this one right here. And you can tell, and this is what people that go into micro expressions look for, is there are certain muscles. And for the sake of this one, there's the Duchenne muscle that can do other things, but one thing is it controls various parts in your face that you can only, in a sense, access and only really use when you're genuinely smiling. And so if you look at it, kind of these wrinkles and, the crow's feet, as they're called, and the eyes are available in the real smile, but not the fake smile. You also see kind of more wrinkling here than over there. Essentially, kind of the smaller squinting of the eyes, all of that is what you would see in a genuine smile. If someone is faking a smile, they can't make that face because those muscles can't be activated. And that's the Duchenne's muscle. So next time you have someone, you make them smile, you can, look and see if they got those crow's feet. All right, going back to the brain. We've talked about all of these things before when we were talking about the different parts of the brain, but the amygdala, as we talked about, is the emotional computer of your brain. It's the emotional center. It has that fear response. It has that fight or flight or freeze. Is another thing that can sometimes happen when faced with fear. All of that is controlled by the amygdala. It's what kind of activates that sympathetic nervous system, which we talked about way, way, way back. And then the hippocampus. As far as emotion is concerned, or, for the sake of this, we're talking about fear, it looks at past experiences where you felt fear, so you can avoid it again. Because the hippocampus, as you remember, is one of the parts of the brain in charge of memory. So it looks back and it says, okay, we're coming up on this dark hallway. Oh, wait, remember that one time that person jumped out at you? And then, it helps you to remember so you can avoid past experiences when you had a strong emotional response. And then the last thing is the cerebral cortex, which again is that kind of executive functioning. It helps evaluate the situation, make a plan, and then directs how to respond to it. So when you're in an emotional situation, it's what helps you to maintain that cool, calm, and to get through that situation. And then there's all these different theories with emotion, about what comes first, the emotion or the feeling or the bodily response. The first one we've talked about before, and we talked about the psychology of love, and we talked about an experiment with people on either a very, very big bridge or a very, very small bridge, and whether or not they called back a researcher. You can look up that study if that sounds interesting. Again, we talked about it in class before, but it's the whole idea that you have the physical response first, and then you experience the emotion or the feeling. So for all of these examples, it's going to be that you're driving in a car and then a deer runs out in front of you. The James Lange theory would say that, you see the deer and immediately your heart, starts pounding, your hands start trembling, and then a little bit afterwards, you then feel the fear. So the emotion is coming after the bodily response. This is different from the Cannon-Bard theory. The Cannon-Bard theory thinks that it happens essentially simultaneously. So you see the deer, and then not only do you experience the heart pounding and the hands trembling, but also the emotion of fear at the same time. So James Lange theory, which this is the one you will need to know for the exam, is the whole idea that the emotion comes after the bodily reaction, whereas Cannon-Bard thinks it happens at the same time. The two-factor model theory is that you have these two different factors. You have the physiological response and the cognitive. This is similar to James Lange, where you have the physiological response first, but it adds this whole idea of cognition. So it's the whole idea of, you realize, oh, my hands are trembling, my heart is pounding, I must be scared. So James Lange kind of thinks that, the emotion comes second, whether you're thinking about it or not, whereas the two-factor model has more of the idea that you think about how your body is responding and then have that emotional response. And then the very last one is the Ledoux dual pathway model. And this is the whole idea that you have kind of this low road and high road response. And so you have this sensory response with more your thalamic and amygdala, where it brings about a quick emotional response. So it doesn't really take much thinking, it doesn't really take much higher processing or anything, and your body responds to it kind of naturally. Then you have the high road, where the sensory information passes through it, and then you're feeling like, oh, I need to watch out for this is dangerous, all of that. So it's a more higher road of processing. And so those are 4 of the theories out there to, how our emotion is expressed and then what happens first, whether it's feeling, bodily response, both at the same time, etc. And then we talked about intelligence before, and one form of intelligence is what we call emotional intelligence. So it's comprised, depending on who you talk to for the sake of this class, it's comprised of 5 different components. First one is knowing your emotions. So being aware of when you're angry, when you're sad, when you're happy. You realize, what your emotion is. And then very, related to that is being able to manage your emotions. So, it's one thing to know when you're getting really, really angry, and then it's another thing to realize, hey, this is a situation where I could be getting really angry, but, this isn't the time or place. I need to calm myself down. Then there's motivating yourself. by, again, approaching challenges with enthusiasm, confidence, delaying gratification. It's that motivation factor, which we talked about earlier in this chapter, being able to push through a situation. Because sometimes when we experience negative emotions, we tend to shut down. But being able to push through a challenge, make it through an obstacle, face it with a smile, takes some emotional intelligence. And then emotional intelligence isn't just about our emotions, but it also looks at recognizing other people's emotions, so having empathy, and then also being able to help other people handle their emotion, which a lot of times we struggle with. Like, we see other people getting upset or getting sad, and we tend to kind of look the other way. But being willing to go and help people and say, hey, you look really upset. Is everything okay? Do you need someone to talk to? Being able to help someone through a rough time also takes emotional intelligence. And then the very last thing we're going to talk about is the polygraph, also known as a lie detector. I see this all the time on YouTube videos, TikToks, what have you, all sorts of social media, where people are getting all upset because, someone will say, oh, this person's lying. The thing about a polygraph is the way that it works is it is looking at essentially a physical response. And the idea is that that physical response is associated with an emotion and a feeling of, guilt or stress when lying. And so with a polygraph, to answer the question, does it work? The answer is yes and no. Once you understand how a polygraph works, they are relatively easy to fool, where you just need to regulate your body's response. And maintain a cool, emotional response, not getting your heart rate up, not, starting to sweat, that sort of stuff, even if you're telling a lie. So all of these instances and all of these videos where people are using polygraphs or, lie detectors, it's not the most accurate. So does a polygraph work? Not so much. And so this is kind of what we went over. We talked about facial expressions of emotion. Again, knowing those components of emotion is important. We talked about the facial feedback hypothesis. So just mimicking a facial expression helps you to feel that emotion. We talked about physiological bases of emotion, so the different parts of the brain. And then we talked about all these different theories as to how emotions come about. And again, the one to be focusing on is that first one there, the James Lange theory, because that's the one you're going to see on the exam. And then we talked about emotional intelligence, which, even though there isn't a specific question on the exam, it's a good thing to be getting good at. And then the polygraph. And again, it's used to detect lying based on analysis of differences in physiological response to control questions and test questions. So if you can regulate that physiological response, you can beat a lie detector. And so that is it. We are now done with Chapter 8. And so we will be starting next week, Chapter 9. And then another test. Yay!